Hello, I'm LaMarr-Bines coming to you from our studios at Mercy College in the Bronx, and I'll be your host for this edition of Issues Under Fire. But before we get started, I've got some hot commentary to whet your appetites for what we intend to share with you today. Office creeps are everywhere and they're out of control. Now, unfortunately, we're compelled to interrupt our regularly scheduled programming today in order to issue an emergency creep alert. Since the Harvey Weinstein revelations, there's been a storm of stories flooding the public square of sexual harassment offenses and worse against women around the world. Honestly, we had no idea this issue was so prevalent. Apparently, creeps are everywhere. With the hashtag #MeToo exploding on Twitter, the topic could no longer be ignored. Something is horribly wrong, because if the majority of these allegations are true, and there's no reason to believe otherwise, that means more men are creeps than not. How do you process these facts? Why has there been an epidemic of creepy behavior gone underreported for so long? Why have so many remained silent for so long? Has it been this way from the beginning of time? Now, was Adam a creep? Was Eve forced to do sexual things against her will? Have men always taken advantage of women like this? As kids, many of us seen cartoons of cavemen dragging cave women by the hair into a cave, but we never saw what happens in that cave. As innocents, most of us simply assumed the cave woman was gonna build a fire to roast some brontosaurus burgers for dinner. However, now we know that what's really been going on, and that's really creepy. What about the concept of being a gentleman? Are gentlemen rare these days? What makes one man a gentleman and another man a creep? In most cases, it can be next to impossible to identify a creep just by looking at him. When the story broke that MSNBC's political contributor and commentator Mark Halpern was a creep, personally I was shocked. My first response was, he didn't look like a creep. I'm sure he fooled a lot of people that way, and that may be the scariest part of this story. Since we're forced to accept these disturbing facts of male behavior, we must admit we don't have a clue as to what to do about it, but we're damn sure gonna try. First of all, we need to know how a creep becomes a creep. Were creeps improperly raised? Are some men just born creeps, or is creepiness a learned behavior? And if that's so, who are they learning to be a creep from? Now please, this is not meant to be glib, but with all the coverage given this story thus far, few seems to be asking these questions. Perhaps if more people explored these avenues of thought, it might be easier to spot a creep in the making. Wouldn't you want to know who the creep was before he's standing too close? By then, it could be too late. Creeps are everywhere, that's a fact, but what can be done about it does not have to remain a mystery. And to help solve this mystery, we've got a human resource professional in studio to help address this problem and offer some solutions. Now stay tuned after this short break and we'll see what Principal HR Consultant with LaMarr-Bines and Associates has to share.
It's a big responsibility.
Oh, it's huge. I know, it's huge.
And the salary.
Oh my god, yes.
Right?
I mean, like, I was about to move in with my parents, and right before, yeah, so this saved me.
I really believe in you, you know?
Thank you. It's nice to hear that from someone.
These are cool. Did you, what did you?
It's not my first time bartending, so.
It's a sausage party in here.
It's fine. I'm very familiar.
Yeah, because you're a sexy girl, Sam. Last thing, totally last thing.
Yeah.
Is that the music, when Momo kicks it into high gear, is going to get a little bit loud in here. So your customers are going to have a hard time hearing you. So you may want to.
What?
Make sure they don't get too close.
Welcome back, and we're here today with Kathy LaMarr-Bines, and if that name sounds familiar to you, in the interest of full disclosure, this young lady is my wife. And, but she's a professional. She's been in the field of human resources for quite some time. She's got a crap load of experience, and she's here to explain and help us understand what happens in the office environment when a woman comes to the human resource department and says, look, I've got a problem. What should I do?
Well, you know, Lee, before we get to that, I thought it was fascinating how you opened the show talking about the prototype of a creep, where do they come from? And I was pretty curious about that myself. So I did some research online and actually found that a guy named John Pryor a psychologist from the Illinois State University, actually created a test, almost a creep alert, if you will. It's called a likelihood to sexually harass on a scale. There's an actual test that one can take and everything. And as a result of his research, he found that there were 3 primary attributes of people who tended to be harassers, primarily males, unfortunately. He said that they had a lack of empathy. They tended to be people that were very authoritarian and had a tendency towards dominance, and that they believed in traditional gender sex roles, which kind of speaks to your whole caveman thing. But on top of that natural proclivity for these individuals, if you put them in an environment that enables such harassing behavior, that sort of exacerbates the situation, and that's what really brings out the worst in these individuals. So coming back to what you were talking about, in a corporate environment, one of the most important things that HR people are responsible for is ensuring that an environment in which harassment is not tolerated is created, set, and supported by not only human resources, but also by leadership and by the management team. So when an individual, first of all, comes to HR has an absolute requirement to act immediately. That's not something to play around with, which is why I'm rather disappointed that in many of these corporate environments, HR did not step in sooner. Now, I know the dilemma in some instances, particularly when you look at Fox News, was the fact that the boss was the biggest offender of all. However, these big corporations have boards of directors to whom HR is also responsible to. So that should have been an option or recourse in those instances. However, in your everyday, if such a thing exists, harassment, when individuals come to HR, immediately HR has to start an investigation after they've talked to the individual to find out what the situation was and who the individuals that were harassing were, and who else might have seen such behavior as well. Once that investigation takes place, then HR has to make a determination on what they're going to do and follow up with. But I'd really like to speak more about environmental factors to help offset harassing behaviors occurring in the workplace. First of all, you need to have a really strong policy, and it needs to be regularly revisited, particularly with managers. One of the funniest stories I have, when I was doing a training course at one of the manufacturing plants for a company I was working with, and one of the supervisors said to me during this harassment prevention training for supervisors, well, Kathy, if as a supervisor I meet someone at a club off hours and I go home with that individual and then find out later that in a big plant there are hundreds of employees, that this person actually works at the plant, could I be in trouble around harassment if she were to bring charges against me? Well, they're adults, consenting adults. However, when one is a manager or a supervisor in an organization, when you have a position of power, it's best not to get romantically involved with your employees.
Now, you know what, let me cut you off right there, because I have a question with regards to the word power. In most of these instances that we've been hearing over the last few months now, the word power has played a very, very strong role. And I was wondering, when you are confronted with higher level employees, beyond supervisor, but people, especially in the sales part of the business, where a salesperson is bringing in a ton of dough for the company, how much power does HR have in terms of dealing with these issues and putting people, bringing people, holding them accountable for their actions?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Really, it's not human resources that has to have the power. Part of human resources' role is to help leadership manage its human assets, much as the finance department helps the leadership manage its financial assets. So as a result, an organization is really important that they have values that are espoused and actually practiced, and that the leadership team fully and wholeheartedly believes in and practices those values. It really starts at the top. So the relationship that HR or the chief HR person has with the senior most executive, the CEO, is really what sets the tone in organizations. I've worked luckily in places where pretty much the CEO was very supportive of environments that are harassment and discrimination free, though that might not necessarily cascade down to all levels of the organization. But HR has to work with the leadership and the management team, and they've got to be wholeheartedly behind it to ensure that these types of behaviors are not tolerated, and that when the rubber hits the road and situations where your highest selling individual is a creep, your values have to come into play then. It's sort of like the old adage, it's not what you do when people are looking at you, it's what you do when nobody is looking that really determines what your character is. Well, the character of the organization is really determined by are you going to deal with a creep in spite of how much revenue he brings into an organization?
Now, you know what? Let me stop you there again, because the operative word in this segment of our conversation is CEO. Now, what happened at Fox News, where the CEO, essentially Roger Ailes, was at the top of the pyramid in that organization. How do you deal, or HR or any other persons that may want to involve themselves in getting justice for the women who've been found, had issues like this? How do you deal with that situation when the CEO is the creep?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
And share, if you could you share some personal experiences? Because if I recall, you worked with a company, we won't mention any names, where the CEO was involved in activities like this. How was that dealt with?
Well, I'll first talk about the Fox situation.
Okay.
That's a tough one, particularly given the amount of power and influence that Roger Ailes had in that organization. I'm sure HR knew what was going on and may have turned their head, a blind eye to it. But that's where the chief HR officer really comes into play, and the relationship that they have with the board. I'm sure that Roger Ailes had to have had a board to which he reported, because they're a publicly traded organization. And that board would probably be the only next higher level that an HR chief could go to in order to at least see what deterrents could be put in place to put a person of such power in check. But it's a tough situation. For me personally, knowing things like that were going on, I would not have continued to work in such an environment. But I may be a Pollyanna, but I expect that of human resources departments, because we're there to help the company realize its conscience and ensure that ethical behaviors are being conducted. The thing that I try to instill in people, in managers, when I do training, is to put the fear of God into them around, do you want to see your company in the headlines associated with these types of behaviors, being creeps, being harassers? From a personal standpoint, I did have an experience with a fairly high-level executive. It was rather lightweight compared to the severity of the things that are going on or being exposed right now in the workplace. But it was inappropriate behavior, and I kind of chuckled it off and backed away from it, but I actually reported it to my higher-up HR person, and they asked me if I wanted to file a formal complaint. And I said, no, I'm a big girl. It was not very untoward. However, you will need to put this person in check, in that a younger woman earlier in her career working in the organization might not have responded similarly to myself, and it would put the organization at great risk. So as a result of that, there was an HR person who was pretty regularly assigned to pretty much handhold this executive and watch what he was doing and where he was going, particularly when party-type after-work situations occurred where people were drinking, because that's where a lot of this stuff happens also, in my experience. when people are having sales parties, holiday parties, and there's drinking going on, that's when people tend to lose their minds.
You know what? I'm getting a message in my ear that we need to wrap this up. But you know what I think we're going to do? We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back for a minute so I can get into the weeds, because there's some other issues that I don't want to leave untouched. We'll be back in a minute.
No doubt you're going places, young lady.
Thank you. And thank you for the interview as well. I can imagine it was the last thing that you wanted to do after such a long campaign meeting.
You really are a very intelligent young woman. You're very smooth.
You're very smooth yourself.
You have no idea.
Welcome back. We still got some questions here that needs to be asked and answered. And as a HR person, you also engaged in a lot of training. And when you've, how did males specifically accept training programs that were put in place to get them to understand what constitutes sexual harassment and what doesn't?
Funny you should ask that. One of the classes that I do actually starts off with a quiz of sorts, asking the men and women the same question and seeing the difference in perception. A question like, would you consider it sexual harassment if a man asks a coworker to engage in sexual activities with them? A question like that, the men and the women both raise their hands. They agree on that. But once you start getting into other nuances, that's where you start seeing the differences between male and female perceptions. For example, one question, one of my favorites is, would you consider a sexual proposition flattering? A survey was done through the American Management Association, and 83% of women said no, whereas 33% of men said no. So one of my favorites was in one of my classes, an elderly gentleman said, heck, if somebody's propositioning me, heck yeah, I'm going to be flattered at my age. However, women don't see the world in that manner. So one of the great things about making it somewhat lighthearted in questionnaires like this is it gives men and women an opportunity openly to see the differences between perception and then it helps grease the skids for real dialogue. And so I also tend to be a dramatic type person. So I'll do things like show men how one statement that seems innocent can be perceived differently depending upon what the body language is and how you're saying it. For example, something as simple as, "That's a beautiful dress you have on today," said like this is pretty innocuous, but "That's a beautiful dress you have on today." When someone's looking you all up, down, and around, same sentence, but delivered in a very different way. Guys kind of get it, and the women will come up with instances and situations in which they may have been made to feel uncomfortable, so that it actually helps to create an atmosphere of dialogue. That's one of the things that one needs to do when you're trying to do training, particularly around areas that are sensitive like this. You want to create a safe environment where people can really talk about differences and the perceptions that they have that might differ. Unfortunately, sometimes when we leave the class, the guy said, "I'm keeping my eyes straight ahead. I'm not looking at anybody. I'm not complimenting anybody
Because
at all."
that
I
could be
know,
a
I
natural
know,
reaction.
I
They
know.
don't know what they can say and what they can't say.
Yeah.
I have an example of this a long time ago. A coworker said this in the office space, a cube farm, if you will. He walked up to another employee and asked her, "If I told you you had a great body, would you hold that against me?" You see the innuendo there?
Sure.
And so I can see where levity, humor, satire could take a whole different turn in a situation in the
Yeah.
work environment.
Yeah, you got to know your audience. If it's a male and female work environment, you can't just consider that if you're a guy that Mary is your buddy and you guys have this repartee on a regular basis that's a bit racy. You've got to consider in a cube environment that there are other people listening as well.
And they may take offense.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly.
Yes.
So you've got to have a certain level of decorum that you've got to uphold in a work environment. And I've worked in places where people tend to be huggy. When you see somebody that works in another location that you haven't seen in a while, you have a good relationship, it's a family type work environment, people go in for the hug. Well, sometimes you need to check and make sure and ask, is it okay for me to hug you? Because some people don't like to be touched.
And if so, how long?
Exactly.
There is, some
Exactly.
gray areas in that situation.
So if someone does something uncomfortable to you, I always suggest to the women to speak on it right then in a way that doesn't have to be particularly confrontive, but just firmly letting a person know, I prefer not to be hugged or touched, or don't come up behind me. Say something to the individual first. Oftentimes it's very innocent, and if you let somebody know what your parameters are, most times they will adhere to that. Once people are told, but they continue to do or exhibit the same behavior, then you're dealing with somebody that you may have to elevate things to the next level. Maybe you have to report them to your supervisor at that point in time.
What if they are your supervisor?
Well, if it's your supervisor, that's a really tough situation. That's where you absolutely need to go to the Human Resources Department, because that needs to be dealt with, because it's got all kinds of implications associated with it, particularly since your supervisor has hiring and firing and raises type of influence over you. So you want to ensure that.
Hence the power we talked about.
Exactly, the power thing.
Yes.
And when HR deals with situations where it's a boss-subordinate type of a harassing situation, you want to make sure that it gets addressed, and that it's addressed in such a way that the employee who has been harassed does not suffer any retaliation, because organizations also need to ensure that they have zero tolerance around retaliation, particularly when someone has power over you, as was the case with Harvey Weinstein.
Exactly.
He retaliated against several of the actresses that didn't go along with him, and as a result, many of them were pushed into obscurity, or they became B and C grade actresses, when in fact they may have had opportunities for greatness, but only if they had exchange them for sexual favors.
Now, you know what, since we're focusing on the workplace, years ago, there was a concept where most major companies kind of looked down on or frowned upon relations between employees because they just brought these situations to the surface. How do you feel about that?
Well, I've worked in organizations where there were particular specific policies in place, anti-fraternization type policies.
Okay.
But given the long hours that people tend to put in at work, oftentimes that's where you find your friends and sometimes your mates. What we really tell people is it's a nightmare for HR when people have office relationships, because when they go well, then everybody's invited to the shower,
Okay.
the wedding shower, the baby shower. But if they go awry, it causes a very uncomfortable situation, not only for the two people who no longer have a relationship, but also to all the people that work around them too, particularly if there's bad blood or hard feelings. And it's really not a good idea to get involved with someone that you work with, particularly if it's the same department. If they work in another office somewhere else, at least you don't have to see them anymore. But if it's somebody a few cubes over, it can really be uncomfortable. So we try to tell people to avoid it.
But not only that, it also leads to the perception that perhaps this person got a raise, perhaps this person got a promotion because they were intimately involved with.
Yeah, you're talking about definitely in a boss subordinate type
Precisely.
situation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. With managers, we try to put the fear of God in them, as I said earlier, to not get involved in relationships with people that report to them. Now, I have worked years ago with a couple who I remain in contact with to this day, where he wasn't her direct boss, but he was one of the bosses. And they were very discreet. They did end up getting married. They're still married to this day, a decade or so later. But they knew that they were at risk if anyone found out. So they actually put in to get transfers to different departments so that there wouldn't be a direct boss-subordinate relationship. And the woman ended up, ultimately his wife, working for someone else in a peripheral department.
Well, you know what, Kathy, I think that we have beat the heck out of this idea, this concept today, and I think we've been able to give our viewers some serious information that they could use. What I like to do is to have you back later on, a few weeks, months down the line, to share some more with us, because I'm of the opinion that this issue is not going away anytime soon.
You're absolutely right. As long as humans are human, and given the differing perceptions between men and women, now that we've sort of opened up Pandora's box, I think it's open for good.
Well, Kathy, thanks for being a part of this show. I know you're my wife. I'm glad you're here. And as I said before, we're going to bring you back. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you next week.